Content warning. This episode contains discussion of child abuse, spousal abuse, the cycle of abuse, and rape.
A pastor and a priest walk into a movie theater. Hi, I'm Father Andrew Miller.
And I'm Pastor Michele Byerly.
And this is A Pastor and a Priest Walk Into a Movie Theater, a podcast about faith, life, and the silver screen. Today we're going to be discussing the musical Into the Woods.
For those of you who have not seen Into the Woods, there's a stage production, and then a few years ago, Disney did a version of it for the silver screen. And so we're going to be talking about two of those versions today with some comparison. And we decided that we couldn't get into the theater without resident theater nerd and music awesomeness, Gail Gallagher, who is our guest today. Gail, would you like to introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about you?
Hi, everybody. Yes, I identify as awesomeness.
It's your religion.
Yes.
But are you practicing?
Yes, I always. I'm Gail Gallagher, and I am a singer, songwriter, musician, theater nerd person. I host the podcast Faith and What Resonates that explores the intersection of spirituality and creativity and how we make meaning in the art. And Into the Woods is a musical that I have made a lot of meaning in throughout my 20s. I actually I have a song that's unproduced that's about how Disney didn't teach us about our 30s. Into the Woods taught us about our 30s. So it's very much a life philosophy, and I'm excited to have this discussion with you today.
Weren't you part of a production of Into the Woods?
I was. So the summer that I went home from college between my sophomore and junior year, the summer musical was Into the Woods, and I worked backstage on it. And while this was going on, a lot of stuff went down in my hometown. So like the metaphors were rife, which we're going to get into the metaphors and the allegory. But it's like there's definitely something to be said about doing a production of Into the Woods when there is like a giant flood in your state and tornadoes and your city is getting it together. And it was a little on the nose. Universe is a little bit on the nose sometimes. And it was interesting looking at it through that lens of Into the Woods. So
was the mayor going to go off and slay the tornado after?
No one went off to slay the tornado. And the particular tornado hit a town like 40-minute drive away from us because we're from the Midwest. We speak in minutes, but yeah, it was like a 40-minute drive away from us. Like it just absolutely knocked out. It was like I forget which town, but yeah, and it was an intense summer, and we did Into the Woods.
So I wondered, you can give a little insight into this for us too, Gail. One of the first things that I noticed, my first introduction to Into the Woods was actually through the screen adaptation. So I don't necessarily, I know there were feelings about this and that adaptation. Can you tell us a little bit about some of those distinctions between storytelling that happen in live theater versus on the screen?
Yeah, that's a great question. So in the biggest differences that I noted with the screen adaptation and the stage version is they cut out a lot of the direct address to the audience, and they grounded there's a couple monologues. So Jack sings Giants in the Sky, and Little Red Riding Hood sings I Know Things Now, and both of them are songs that are sort of their growing up moments. And in the play, those are sung directly to the audience, and it is like their aha moment monologue. And in the movie, it's like they're sung to the baker, which I thought was a really interesting choice. And also, I feel like when I watch it on stage, because they are doing the monologue to the audience, and it's like, they're using sort of the presentational like those moments where there's giants in the sky, those moments where you're swallowed by a wolf. And so like there's more of that direct address, but when you see it on the screen, it's like, I am telling you the literal story of this literal thing that happened. Look at our literal breeding stock. And you can still get some sense of that metaphor, but it is really striking how it feels more directed to the audience and them going on this journey when it is presentational. Other differences that I noted include Disney, surprise, surprise, like really pulled back on all the deaths. Spoilers, my friends, lots of people die in Into the Woods. But like I noticed that they didn't and they knocked the baker's wife off the cliff. So she still dies, but they knock her off a cliff, which is a common way that we kill people in Disney because we can't actually have anybody be accountable. Rapunzel doesn't die, which really undercuts the so I really love the moment where, I mean, not love, but resonate with the moment where like Rapunzel gets stepped on by the giant, or there's some sort of like she goes off stage and it's very clear she's killed by a thing, and that inspires the witches, like, careful the things you say, children will listen. And it just does not pack the punch if there isn't that moment, and I will be in this conversation, I will be the well actually person, but those are the first things that come to mind.
Yeah. Well, and it is interesting that, so as I was thinking about this this conversation today, the origins of fairy tales, right? Like Grimm's fairy tales, Hans Christian Andersen. If you read them in their originals, they're much more gruesome.
Mm-hmm.
And part of that is really interesting when you contrast that with Disney's tendency to want to sanitize and clean things up.
Mm-hmm.
Because part of the purpose of fairy tales when they were told is to prepare children for a world that isn't happily ever after, that isn't perfect, that doesn't end with the wishes granted and everything is all good, that there are deaths, that there are giants in the woods, there are these things that happen, and so what I like about the play version particularly is, you're right, it leans into that more.
Yeah, it's an authentic story. There's this authenticity, and there's this like it's interesting to have that experiment of like, oh man, I miss all the deaths. But you do, because that's what makes Act 2 so like hard and so good, is that there is that darkness to it.
It takes place after the happily ever after too.
Mm-hmm.
It's it's interesting how Act 1 sort of sets up a happily ever after, and then Act 2 I mean, in many fairy tales, so we never see what happens after the happily ever afters, especially Disney fairy tales, but in fairy tales more generally, it's sort of implied that they live what Margaret Atwood would call stimulating and challenging lives. But Act 2 sets up what happens after the fairy tale, or after the fairy tale ending, and it's not a fairy tale ending. It's quite dark.
Yeah. Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think a lot about how there's this I've noticed this phenomenon in my life, this idea of that I called fairy princessing, which is where you're like, if only this thing will happen, and then everything will be great, and then that thing happen, and then life continues to happen. And it's that sort of concept of grasping for a thing, whereas if you look at it, and this is almost a more like Buddhist look at it, where it's like, no, happily ever after is a state of mind. Like, it's something that you tap into, but it's not like dependent on like, I got my specific wish. That is certainly a highlight, but it's like learning that like, nah, stuff's complicated. And,
Well, and I think part of it is that life is just as much about the journey as it is about getting that wish. And I think that's a big piece of this story. And I see that when I was thinking about tying this back into scripture, particularly in the Christian Old Testament, the story of Joseph, right? He has this big dream where he sees his brothers bowing down to him, and he has all this success and everything, which eventually does happen. But it takes a really long road and a lot of hardships and all of this to happen before he gets there. And I think that that's true of, when I think about this idea about having wishes, right? Mm-hmm. That we may get it, it may not happen in the way that we think. And sometimes on the journey, even the wish changes. Yeah. And maybe we realize there's something else instead.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, the film begins with "I wish," the very first line in the film, the musical, and then it's that wish, the three wishes, sort of spiral out of control, and it's the boy's wish that leads to the apocalypse at the end that almost gets them all killed and gets many of them killed. So it's sort of a morality play on the danger of wishing. And of course, I think we see that in what Cinderella's late mother says to her. Are you sure? And I think you picked this for your sermon, Michele, are you sure that what you wish is what you want? It's I hear in that a kind of the cliche, be careful what you wish for.
Yeah.
So what theological themes do you see in this, Gail?
One thing that I really think about that jumps out to mind is a concept that Richard Rohr always brings out, which is this idea of, in our theological formations, order, disorder, and reorder, and this this cycle that we go through. And I think that it definitely highlights that aspect, and that's also within the hero's journey, and and how just the stuff we go through works, where we transform through crisis and all of that. So I think that always jumps out at me, and also the difference between grasping for something that you want, or having these high expectations, and then what do we do when our expectations are dashed. There's a lot of I have a lot of sort of Buddhist adjacent thoughts, because that's sort of the mix I'm in. Listeners who, if you haven't listened to my show or heard me speak, my sort of alignment as a Unitarian Universalist is Catholic mystics and Buddhism in a pot. With that's sort of my zone, plus whatever else I pick up. So yeah, I think those are some of the things that jump out for me. I just love how wise this show is, and I love how it feels just so real compared to the princess movies that I grew up with.
You mentioned Richard Rohr on order, disorder, and reorder. There's a Protestant theologian named Walter Brigham who does a version of this in a study of the Psalms, and he notes that there are Psalms of orientation, which praise God for the order in the world. Often the repetitive trope in them is that it's an order that will never be shaken, that sort of thing. Psalms of disorientation, where the Psalter expresses anger with God in the midst, or sad, deep and profound sadness, fear in the midst of great chaos, particularly the experience of the exile, which might be akin to a giant like Babylon stepping on Jerusalem. And then Psalms that of new orientation, which are sort of a great trope in them, is sing a new song to the Lord, because the old songs don't work anymore. They speak of redemption and the experience of peril and coming out of the peril. And I suppose I saw the end, especially is sort of expressing that kind of that theology, and I saw it especially in the boy, who is attached to his cow, And then he discovers in a line in which he says that there's a dialogue between him and Red Riding Hood. When Red Riding Hood says, I'll be your mother now. And he says, I don't really want a mother, I want a friend. And it's sort of, I felt that kind of his coming of age, his sort of realizing of what he wants his new orientation to be. So, and his putting away of his idols. And of course, idolatry. His friend is a cow. There's a interesting parallel there.
Yeah, he does. Jack is so lonely.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. No, that is the thing. He does find his friendship there.
Yeah. So, coming of age is a very strong theme in the story, and I know if he were here, Editor Wesley has a lot of thoughts about Red Riding Hood and the wolf. So if you'll, dear Editor Wesley, if you'll let me speak for that for you, these are thoughts that I have as well. There's a lot to unpack with this, with Red Riding Hood and her interaction with the wolf and the songs after. There's definitely I'm just going to call it a sexual metaphor there.
Oh yeah,
and growing up and maturity, and I know things now that I didn't know before. In the biblical sense, knowing has a particular meaning in the Old Testament.
That's in keeping with the fairy tale, because the to gobble her up, the phrase "gobble her up" at the time would have been understood as a euphemism for sex. Mm-hmm. So, I think that Sondheim very intentionally kept that in. And of course, you can't help but not notice that the wolf has a penis. And it's right there.
Or is Johnny Depp,
right.
which is a casting choice that did not age the best. It's not great.
Yeah. So, and then she talks about, he showed me things, many valuable things, and then later on she says, nice is different than good. Mm-hmm. And that's, I think, an important thing to think about. But the other thing that I thought about with that whole concept of the big bad wolf are these stories that we tell ourselves as a culture. And one of those stories I think about particularly is, and this is where we should probably throw in a content warning at the beginning about rape, because we see predatory situations here and there's metaphor there. And so often we tell our story that, oh, it's the big bad wolf out there coming to get you, mm-hmm. instead of the friend mm-hmm. the family member and I think that, so that as a bigger philosophical thing, thinking about, again, the purpose of fairy tales was, this is what you told little girls so they didn't go running off into the woods on their own. And there's some extent to which these were ways to keep kids in line,
And yet that misses the abuse that's taking place in their own houses.
Uh-huh. Exactly.
And I don't know. I didn't catch anything that I would consider abusive in Red Riding Hood's relationship with her grandmother, although her grandmother was somewhat sadistic towards the wolf, perhaps rightly so. But if there was abuse to be had, I think, well, it was definitely in Cinderella's relationship with her step
and even to an extent with Jack and his mother.
Exactly. That's where I was going. Yeah. Because although I wonder if that was more par for the course in the way children might have been raised at the time, and that may be a bit of a futurist prejudice on my part. But
definitely the interaction with children has changed over time, and what the norms are around how parents treat children mm-hmm. has changed.
Well, and the fairy tale itself, in its more traditional expression, could be considered a kind of abuse, because it teaches children that you better damn well behave, or you're going to or the world is going to kill you. And well, there's some truth to that, but it certainly teaches children that the world is an evil, horrible, and ugly place, that you can't trust people, you can't well, it's more complicated, but it's a
or
really,
it's
really,
at least your situation isn't as bad as that.
it's a use of fear. It's the use of fear to raise children. And I mean, I think nowadays, like for instance, it's the threat of spanking, right? It's the use of fear to manipulate children into behavior, certain behaviors. So
yeah.
What do you think about Cinderella's? One thing that I caught in Act One was Cinderella's is sort of conflicted. She's and I think she runs away from the prince, and I think it's implied that she runs away from the prince because, well, at a simplistic level, she's not sure if being wedded to a prince is what she wants. But in a deeper level, and I think this comes out in her conversations with the baker's wife, she seems to suggest, she says, he's a nice prince, right? And it almost seems to me as though she understands that at some level the prince is not a good guy.
Mm-hmm.
That she's not, she's sort of caught up in her own fairy tale wish and the realization that this is way too simplistic, and the prince is charming and nice, but he's not really
but not
good.
raised to be sincere.
Yeah, and I think she sees that. Like, part of her is seeing that right at the outset, and she's and I think that's what leads her to run away.
And I noticed in her initial monologue, and I'd never noticed this before, but in her initial bit of be kind Cinderella, nice, good, nice, good, nice. Like, that is a repetitive line. So she's the first person to bring in the line about to start to explore what it means to be nice versus being good. And then that sort of appears in her through line. But I hadn't noticed that before because, of course, there's the iconic moment that the witch sings later. But yeah, I noticed that she was the first one to bring that phrase to the table. I also noticed in her song of where she makes the decision not to decide.
Yes,
which is a decision.
And that's
a decision.
I found that at once sort of empowering in a good way, and not. On the one hand, it's leaning into the fact that she doesn't know what she wants, and she's afraid to make a choice. But on the other hand, I thought that was somewhat empowering.
Yeah.
I mean, there is sort of an empowerment in sort of allowing oneself to choose not to choose, to just sort of let it happen. And it's almost Buddhist. It's almost Stoic in its.
Yeah, it's like there's a delegation to it. Like, this is now a him problem, and this is no longer my problem.
Yeah.
If he shows up at my doorstep, it is now a me problem. But
yeah,
I like that. It definitely lands differently.
Mm-hmm. Also, while we're talking about that whole scene, can we talk about the fact that she thinks that he loves her because he spreads pitch on the stairs, and it's like, okay, let's have a conversation about the fact that so often in this play or movie, there's this idea of love that is so twisted, about what and we do that to kids, right? We say, oh, he hit me. Well, that's just his way of saying he loves you. Bull.
And one thing without going too far down the rabbit hole, like when I was a wee teenager, 20-year-old, and dating and whatnot, like I tended to get these very put people on a pedestal crushes, and I called that phenomenon fairy princessing. And what I appreciate about Into the Woods is it has archetypes. It's like, okay, but is this person a baker? Is this person a prince? Is this person a wolf? There are these like and just like having that thing where it's just like, oh no, that was a Prince moment. Like that was a moment in the woods, and that person is being a dude.
Dipshit.
And there isn't an archetype for like terrible men in like mainstream things.
Because the terrible man is the charming prince, and it sort of it shows by playing with the archetype. It shows how the archetype can be purely what it is, and it's the very archetype itself that leaves holes in the character. It's the very it makes you wonder, like, okay, so Cinderella gets her prince at the end of Cinderella, and I'm talking about Cinderella, not Into the Woods. But okay, so all of that can be true, all of the charmingness, and even the fact that they were relatively happily ever after. But there's a lot of holes in that too. I mean, they could still have a very abusive relationship. They could still have. I mean, the Prince Charming could still be a dick, and in every way, and an abusive father. And I mean, just because they live happily, I mean, the word happy. I mean, the word happy is just an emotion. Gladness, right? It's one of the 5 basic emotions, and gladness is just the feeling of being glad about something. It's not joy. It's not the more deep deep contentment that I think Buddhism and Christianity and other faiths would strive after, but it's just happiness, and there's a lot of room for real suffering and happiness too.
So one of the things I did like of the movie is how much they hammed it up with the song Agony.
Oh my gosh.
You know, because you have these two princes. I mean, they have these 2 princes that are just talking, and it's almost like an entitlement, right? It's almost like they're entitled to these women to have their affections, and that if they like them, they should be delighted to be married to these princes. And they talk about, you know, just being just out of reach. And so kind of playing along with that idea, you know, but I did love that part. That's probably one of my favorite scenes in the movie version is that where they're like ripping shirts open and they're splashing through the waterfalls, and
which is why I hate what the movie does at the end with Rapunzel. Because it honestly makes it seem like Rapunzel and her prince have a happily ever after or a joyful ever after, when and in reality I think that, and the movie I think does touch on this, how really deeply hurt Rapunzel is, and how really, you know, she's a victim of abuse, and she's working through her woundedness in that. And I'm not, although to be fair to the movie, it doesn't really show what their relationship is like afterwards, but it honestly seems as though that, you know, she gets away with her prince, whereas in the musical she commits suicide. And I really interpret her being crushed by the giant as her choice, that she chooses to end her own life, death by giant. And I feel like what they did with Rapunzel was not realistic.
Yeah.
Well, and you know, the tragedy of her is that she goes from one abuse to a potential other.
The cycle.
You know, yeah. So she doesn't know what a healthy relationship is, frankly, because all she knows is her mother who has kept her locked up in this tower.
Nominally to protect her.
Yeah. Well, yeah.
Oh. And did I forgot if in the play, this was another difference I noticed, but in the play, it was the prince falls into the briars, and in the movie, the witch straight up makes them so that his eyes are poked out. Like it is. Yeah. So that was that, and that made her that much more intense. Like,
yeah. There, I wrestle with the character of the witch, because
Me too.
There's some levels of, yeah, she's wrong, but there are some levels in which she's right. And she says it. You know, I'm not good, I'm not nice, I'm just right. In
a cynical way.
Yeah.
Her rightness is her cynicism. She sees the world as evil and she knows how to play it. That's her rightness.
Yeah. And I would kind of agree with her to some extent on some things. So
She and her the sermon topic that I chose, preview of coming attractions listener, is the idea of careful what you say, first, children don't listen. Children should listen, but they don't. And then actually, it turns out careful what you say, children will listen. They just don't listen in the way you anticipate.
right.
And I'm torn between, on the one hand, that message, which I think is very valuable, and on the other hand, the sense of narcissism, the sense of parental narcissism, of always constantly worrying that what I say is somehow going to fuck up Scarlett, my daughter. Because at the end of the day, yeah, I do have a profound impact on Scarlett, but also Scarlett is her own person and she can make her choices. And at the end of the day, how she turns out, if I say that it's all to do with every little detailed mistake that I made, that's narcissism on my part. So I'm torn on that, but I that was the part as a parent that really touched me the deepest. Careful what you say, children will listen.
My next thought is the elimination of the narrator.
I was just going to go there. Yes.
Yeah. And this idea that you have someone telling you what is going to happen, and I not almost sort of, almost, I guess, parenting the story, and then he gets knocked out.
Yes. And I think that the movie botched that, because that was such an important part of the whole story, to have that piece of the story where they say, who are you to tell us what we're supposed to do here? We don't like the way you're telling it.
It's an existentialist moment. It's an assertion of post-foundationalism. It's a very Nietzschean.
Post-foundationalism.
I might have just made that term up, but the idea of existentialism as one's existence precedes one's essence. In other words, how we exist in the world, how we encounter the world, precedes the world as it should be, the world as it as we understand it through the lens of things like morality and formal ontology and things like formal modes of being, that sort of thing. This is in contrast to more traditional moral philosophy and traditional ideas of being, which also, for instance, Plato's theory of forms, the idea that the world as we encounter it is an imperfect instantiation of more perfect forms, right? So that's an essentialist or foundational philosophy, where the essence of reality precedes the existence of reality. Now, existentialism, although it's not specifically responding to Plato, reverses that. It says, no, we build the forms. We create the forms. We create morality. But our existence precedes our essence. So to me, the death of the narrator is what Nietzsche would call the death of God. Like, it is the realization that we don't need the narrator anymore. We don't need God anymore. We can create our own reality and create our own forms and our own sense of what to do next. Now, by leaving that out, I think that the movie's choice is to say that the narrator was the baker all along. That the whole unfolding of the film was basically a flashback. It was the narrator telling his son the story after it had all transpired. I think there's some merit to that. It's because it is the narrator it is the baker sort of using the telling of the story to create the new reality, and I think the stage does that too. But it misses something in the movie in that on the stage, the baker creates the new reality by basically seizing the place of God. Sorry, that was long.
And he takes the story, and you actually see his moment of being more involved, because you also have no more which is also like a gorgeous song, and I am still angry that they cut it. But like that's sort of him taking more ownership in No More, and then you have that connection of the narrator being double cast as the mysterious man / his father. Spoilers, and so. Yeah, you have that through line of the narrator was also his father, and so it's sort of passing it on generationally in that way too, you know. So yeah, like it's way better if he then takes up the mantle instead of it was
It was him all along.
It was him all along. You know. And this is also making me think of sort of one of my observations with the movie, like my overall thought is in a play about allegory, do we really need to see you feed objects to a literal cow? Do we need a literal cow? You know? I mean, that's sort of one of the charming things about Into the Woods is how the this will lead you listeners, this will lead you down a rabbit hole, but there is a site called lowbudgetmilkywhites.tumblr.com, which is all of the terrible Milky Whites that have been done in stage plays. But like that's one of the iconic things is like, is like we're storytelling. This is all in allegory. This cow is very fake and it's fine.
Yeah. Oh, I love that.
The cow functions as an idol.
Yeah.
I mean, I think the cow is not only fake in the way, except in the movie, in the way in the stage production, they stage the cow, but it's also fake in the sense that the cow is fake. The cow is an idol. It represents idolatry, and it represents it's the thing that is used to produce the elixir that the witch, the enchantress needs to restore her youth. Right? It is the linchpin that brings all the other objects together. Right? And indeed, there's a sense in Jack's journey whereby Jack sort of grows away from being a friend to this idol to having a real friend in Red Riding Hood. There's also a sense, and I noticed this, when the way Jack sings it, especially in the stage musical, the way he sings Giants in the Sky, there's a religious element to it, right? And what is God but a giant in the sky, right? I mean, and like his sort of religious reverence for the giants, although he steals from them, as humans often steal from God, and yet sort of Jack's journey is sort of putting away not only the idol of the cow, that sort of naturalistic idol that does the things we want, to the God, the great God in the sky that watches over us and punishes us, to simply human friendship.
Yeah. That's like, I don't think I noticed like the plot of Jack's like loneliness until this conversation. And when I think about it in that context, like I've always seen like Giants of the in the Sky. Yeah. Part of the metaphor is like having like an epiphany or something and having that sort of transcendent experience. But also, like he has this fondness for the Lady Giant, and this reverence for her, and I think some of that is like he needs a friend, he needs that connection, and like he finds this connection. But yeah, he's looking for connection with cows, he's looking for connection with giants, when he just needs to like hang out with the slightly scary chick with the wolf cape, Like,
so would you guys say that everyone in the story is lonely in some way?
Absolutely.
Because that's I mean, as we're talking about Jack, I'm taking it even wider and saying everybody in some way has a sense of loneliness, and to some extent the end of the movie is about, no one's alone and we'll make our own family.
Especially the baker and the baker's wife. I have to wonder about their marriage. because it seems very happy and a very, very at a very, very surface level. Of course, well, I mean, they can't have a child, and they're very openly unhappy about that. But on the other hand, well, they're very kind and gentle to each other. But well, it's very, very clear that the baker's wife, by the way, she's never named that I know that I caught. So it's interesting. This is the baker's wife.
Neither of them are ever named. Yeah.
Well, I guess anyway. The baker's wife is it clearly dreams of something more, something better. It doesn't really like she's kind of. I think she wonders sort of why the hell am I with this baker? And
Yeah.
And also, like, they are the people that were raised on the fairy tales. They're kind of Mary. Well, they're not Mary Sue's, but they kind of are. Like, you know, like the Act 1 where they're running around in the woods and finding all the things is like fan fiction meets a scavenger hunt, and it's like, all right, now we're a part of this story, and yeah, they get to, like, there's a sense of like there's the initial metaphor of like when we go through terrible things, but then there's also this metaphor of like being pulled into this story and like having this like having a peak moment or having these moments that are out of like ordinary life. Yeah, and they also exemplify sort of like the what happens after happily ever after when you're like a baker, you know, like what, because there aren't any fairy tales that talk about what happens after you're married.
Very few that I know of.
It's everybody's young, and then who knows what happens. That's not a
well,
thing. Well,
clearly we can't describe to children what happens after the wedding. That's just no.
Well, that's it. But like even separate of like of the and then they have kids, okay, hooray. But like even separate of that, it's like, okay, what are your dreams now? What are you doing now? What is next? What are the things that people aspire to, right? You know, and especially for like female characters, like we super don't get plot lines that aren't connected to like finding a man.
There was a comedian who said women or men are taught to be something, women are taught to find someone. And I think that's fairy tale princesses are with the exception, I think, of the post 1990s Disney World, when I think they're trying to redeem themselves a little bit. But fairy tale princesses are taught to find Prince Charming.
Well, and I think about back to the relationship between the baker and his wife. There's also this trope of like if a woman does try to have any authority or say in things, she comes off as the henpecker and the nag and all of that. And there's some extent to which that happens here as well, where she's portrayed that way.
Yeah, it's always like, oh, well, go stay home. I got this. Go away. Like, it's like, oh, man. Like, gotta delegate.
What do you think about her falling? Is falling the right word? Engaging with the prince.
I go ahead.
No, you go.
I look at that through a power lens. I think that she didn't really have an option to say no.
Yeah.
You know, how do you say no to a prince?
Yeah. It's interesting because it really depends on how it's staged. And you even see that when you look at the stage production compared to the movie production. I've seen stage productions where there's a little bit, her acting is a little bit more like, I am in the story now. Like, I'm sucked into this story, and it's more of a romance. But like in the movie, it was a little it was a little bit more aggressive on the prince's end, and it really depends on it. And I've seen a bunch of different stage productions, and yeah, how it is handled is different. And I have like a soft spot for that song, but yeah, it in the end, yes, it comes down to power, and it is deep. There is always going to be a level of discomfort. but also that moment is really how it is staged is so important. Like it's an important part of the directing and the acting and of how you want to treat that moment.
Yeah.
You know?
There is a sense, I feel, in which she does get to indulge a fantasy, whether she initially wanted to or not. Because, I mean, throughout the course of Act 1, she fantasizes about what it would be like to have a. I mean, she even says, if a prince was chasing me, I wouldn't run from him.
Mhm.
So, but I agree. It is about power. I mean, she really doesn't have much of a choice. It's interesting though how that power differential plays on the dynamics of her own sort of fantasy life. Is that the way to put it?
Yeah.
And then, so another question, and this is where I admit I'm colored by the movie production. You know, it plays it more aggressively, and then it's quite immediate after that she dies, and it's almost like, is that kind of a karmic punishment for her straying off path, getting away, and boom, she dies.
I mean, and how much of that is like, and is the karmic punishment element harder if you knock her off a cliff versus getting her stepped on by a giant?
Yeah.
Like, yeah.
Yeah. Although she is, well, even the way I say this is problematic, because where my mind went was thinking of it as an indiscretion rather than as if it was something that she had an equal choice in. But that's sort of where my mind went. So I'll finish the thought, and by all means, call me out for it. She redeems herself. See how problematic that where my thought went in her song about how she says it's time to leave the woods and go back to her husband. And isn't it that wow, my how trained I am in problematic thinking.
And her moment with herself is actually like really like there's a little bit of self-compassion to it, where it's just like, this is a moment, like this is a thing that happened, this is a thing, and now we're gonna go. Like,
and now it's time to leave the woods.
Like, it's like, all right, and that whole line of like, if life were made of moments, it's like, then you'd never know you'd had one. Like,
had one.
Yeah. And so there's, it's not, she doesn't, I don't think she judges herself for it. I think she's like in awe of it and like processing it, but
which is why I guess I resist the idea of her death as punishment. And I think I'm not disagreeing with you, Michele. I think you can definitely see it.
There's a lot of reads to it, and I'm trying to think about how I see it versus how it could be read versus because I'm with you. I don't blame her at all for what happens.
And indeed, I think part of the point of the show is sort of the randomness of things. That things do happen at random. That we try to find patterns in reality. Well, and that is what theology is. We try to find patterns in reality that speak to something deeper. And in reality, well, a lot of times it's just there are no patterns to be found. It's random.
Everything happens, and then we make up the reason.
Which gets me into the conversation about, I love the song. I don't know what it's called, but everyone's like, well, it's your fault. No, it's your fault.
Yes.
Yes. Because for me, I use that when I'm talking to my confirmation students about the story of Adam and Eve.
Absolutely.
In Genesis, because it's like, that's really kind of what's going on, right? Everyone's trying to, it wasn't me. And then in the end, they all kind of were like, okay, I shouldn't have done this. And they take ownership for where they're at. But it's just really interesting, the need to find blame, and the witch calls them out on that.
And the witch becomes a kind of Christ figure at that moment. Because it's amazing how I love in the stage production how it's your fault, and then all of a sudden they're interrupted by the witch it's the last midnight. And she goes into essentially revealing to them the prophetic truth of everything that has just happened, of everything that they are. And it's like it's amazing. This person whom we see as I'm not sure if we see her this way or if we're supposed to see her this way, but she sort of seems an antagonist, right? In this moment, she's a kind of prophet. She speaks the prophetic truth. She brings the characters into an encounter with themselves, who they really are, and it's that's a beautiful moment. Sorry.
Yeah. No.
And then she dies.
And then she dies, which so that moment is always interesting because it's like, wait, so her magic got taken away. So how does she get zapped? And
it's interesting.
Like,
well, the movie kind of explains it by saying, well, it was her mother's spirit that killed her. She asked her mother's spirit to basically kill her again. And I read her death as a kind of atoning death, I guess you could say, and as a kind of Christ death, that she sort of takes on herself sort of the responsibility of everything that has transpired, and in kind of taking herself out of the situation, she gives the other four the freedom to kind of move on and rebuild.
Yeah, she says, if y'all need to blame someone, fine, blame me.
Yeah. And then she storms out in a puff of fabulous.
So, and it's interesting too, kind of a parallel that I see in the first act, or maybe I'm trying to remember when exactly it is, but it's between the baker and the wife, and they've lost the cow, and they're both kind of bickering at each other, and the witch just says, "Who cares?
Yes,
the cow's gone. Get the cow."
Yep.
And so there's a sense in which the witch is very pragmatic in the whole story. Like, she's the one who says, "Okay, let's just give him the boy."
Yeah.
Give her the boy. Give the giant the boy. Let's just do what we need to do.
Yeah.
To deal with this.
Yeah, which is sort of that being able to like hold all of the complexities of the situation and be like, well, that's what happened, and now we need to do this thing. Like, it's very pragmatic. It's very parental. It's very like, this is where you need to be when you're like past the place of like blaming people, and then you're just like, okay, this is what we're doing. I can hold the complexities. You're not good. You're not bad. You're just nice.
Act 1 critiques capitalism, totally. Especially in the whole theft of the gold, but also the song that the baker's wife has. You go out and take it, right? You go out and you know what you want. You go out and you seize it.
Oh, it's not in my notes, but one of my thoughts was like if you know what you want, you go out and you find it and you take it. I wrote in my notes like, this hits differently when you've read a bunch of business guru nonsense.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's like, on the one hand, I mean, it's honestly, I feel like that's a line that's supposed to show the audience something about themselves, because we live in a world where that is the virtue. And so, and yet I think it's the way it's sung is it's supposed to be, the audience is supposed to react to that like, well, no, I mean, obviously that's not, wait a minute.
Hashtag rise and grind. Take that hair from that lady in the tower. Like,
yeah. Well, and then there was we were needy, you were greedy. Did you need that hen? You'd already gotten what you needed. Did you have to go for more?
I wish they would have done more with that, because I feel like maybe you could contrive some economics in what happens subsequently, but at the end of the day, and maybe I'm missing things, but at the end of the day, it seems to me like the rest of the musical is more existential in its expression of meaning, but they didn't really do much with the economics of the situation.
I mean, well, yeah, I guess the parts are still, the economics of it are there though, because like with Jack and and them like needing like like they're Jack, being in that sort of that scarcity place and like stealing from giants because like they need the money, and sort of the idea of like Cinderella and the prince, and like that dynamic as well. Like there's a lot of power structures and capitalist shenanigans and fairy tales, and in fact there's a lot of fairy tale elements inside capitalism with, I mean, if you wanted to go down that hole.
Yeah, we probably shouldn't go down that rabbit hole, so let's do it.
All
So,
right.
no, I mean, feudalism as a moment. I'm going to pull some Marx here. Feudalism as a moment in economic development. Of course, Marx says that that you have primitive communism, slave society, what we know as like the great empires and that sort of thing, feudalism, capitalism, and then, God willing, socialism. Of course, Marx wouldn't say God willing, but I will. Anyway, no. It didn't all happen at once. There's sort of a flow, right? So you see the beginnings of capitalism springing up within feudalism, right? So you've got the feudalism in the sense of the royal family, who are basically do-nothings, right? I mean, they don't do anything. That's said several times in the musical. They do nothing. They're just useless. They go out and seduce young maidens. That's all they do, right?
I don't have the constitution to fight giants.
Right, there you go.
I'm gonna go hide in my summer home.
And then you see the beginnings of capitalism, that petite bourgeois capitalism, in the baker and the baker's wife, because that's where capitalism comes from, right? That's the sort of that sort of self-made industry that eventually built on itself and built on itself and built on itself until it's actually major industry, and it supplants feudalism as the major power structure, right? So all of that is there, and I'm not really sure where I'm going with that, but it's all there in the show. But and it is interesting how the ideology of the baker's wife, especially, and to a lesser extent the baker, and it's interesting how it's the baker's wife who is more strongly capitalistic than the baker, but they're both share the ideology that you know what you want, you go out and you take it, right? The ideology follows their material situation, right? So, and that's very Marxist in its own sense. The Marx would argue that Marx, takes this idea that, we act according to our beliefs and reverses it. No, we believe according to how we counter the material world, right? Our ideology is presented to us by the ways in which we encounter our reality and how we interact with our reality in order to survive. And so the baker and his wife have a capitalist ideology of going out and seizing the day because that's their reality. They have to in order to survive. They have to go out there and seize what they need in order to live. Whereas the ideology of the feudal lords is, well, we've had generations where all we've had to do is sit in our castle and just be. And so that's all we are. Of course, there is feudalism comes out of a sense of warrior ethic. I mean, it is essentially the warriors, the warrior knights supplanting the old imperial hierarchy. And there is that in the prince's, I'm going to go out and slay a giant. On the other hand, it turns out to be full of shit because the prince doesn't do anything. It's useless because he's old money. So anyway, that was that. Thank you for coming to my Marxist TED Talk.
Oh gosh.
So what do you think about the woods? The symbolism of the woods. Into the woods.
It's almost a parallel to the wilderness in scripture, in Christian scripture, where the wilderness is kind of this place where you come to encounter the divine, where it is metaphor for a journey. And in that regard, the woods are very much kind of a character into themselves, where these people are taking a journey, they're figuring out who they are, they're changing along the journey.
It made me think of Nathaniel Hawthorne's The Scarlet Letter, because the woods play a very interesting role in, well, American Romanticism more generally, and German Romanticism. And of course, fairy tales form a sort of foundation on which literary romanticism is built, right? But the idea of the woods as a kind of character, the idea of the woods as a kind of dark place where spirits are and where you go and find things that are otherworldly. And then there is we have and it made me think of something that we say in our political discourse, the weeds. Into the weeds. When we want to talk about policy, when we talk about deep stuff, we say, let's get into the weeds, right? Let's get lost in this thickness of stuff. And to me, and there's a line in that Red Riding Hood sings, the woods are just trees, the trees are just wood. Are they? Is anything ever really what it seems? Or is there this hidden reality into which we walk in and encounter like life-changing moments?
And
just moments in the woods.
Okay, I got my thought back. So yes to all of the things, and also it makes me think of a class I took my freshman year of college that was like it was an overview of literature that had many tangents and thoughts that were all interconnected according to the professor's brain, as one does. And one of the themes was nature versus society, and like disorder and order, and how nature is portrayed in different forms of literature, and the feminine, the masculine, and all of the rabbit holes all of the time. Dr. Gecky ever stumbles upon this. Hello.
Oh my
I still think
gosh.
about your class. Oh my goodness.
I miss Uncle Joey.
Uncle Joey. Yes, he referred to himself as Uncle Joey and would go on rants about a society. Yeah. It was good times.
And he talked about some of that in his American literature class too. So anyway, go on.
So that his favorite rabbit holes have stuck with me apparently. But yeah, it's this idea of going into this unknown, chaotic place and being in this and just not knowing what is going to happen, and and for me the woods are like a crisis moment, and those where you just have to keep following the path, and you have no idea what's going to pop up or what's going to happen. And if you've been in the woods a few times, you know some of the different paths. It also makes me think of a phrase my mom would say, which is someone who's been to hell and back and knows all the good restaurants. Like you've been through the woods a few times, you know some of the nooks and crannies, but it's still going to continue to surprise you.
What you said made me think of this. In the beginning of the second act, they discover there are no paths. That the paths that they had used before were gone. So it was just woods now, just a forest with nowhere. Like, it was far more difficult to get your bearings.
And now you have to make your own way.
Yeah, I would say that this is, and of course, it's been a long time since I took a class on existentialism. And if anybody from my church is listening to this, this is not an endorsement of existentialism, but I would say that this is an existentialist play / movie. That it is about the death of gods and foundations and the beginning of new order that is imposed by human beings. So.
Yeah, and about learning to make your own path when you realize that the road, what you've been following, has fallen apart. And realizing that you can control your own narrative now.
So, Gail, have you ever preached a sermon?
I have not.
You're about to.
Oh, great.
So, if you were writing a sermon on this, what would the takeaway be for the congregation, Gail?
So, what jumps out to me is happily ever after is a state of mind. And I think I would talk about two things. I would talk about, I would either title it Act 2 or Happily Ever After is a State of Mind. And I would talk about, if I'm focusing on Act 2, the takeaways would be about those moments in life where we enter an act 2 situation and work through a conflict, and act 2 is always the best part of a musical, and it's because it's where we get real with ourselves, and we and so learning to treasure those moments of transformation and recognize those moments and feel that gratitude for those moments, but then get out of the woods.
So, Michele, if you were preaching a sermon, what would the takeaway be?
I think my title would probably be careful what you wish for, because I resonate with the idea of, do you know what you want? Are you certain what you wish is what you want? And just this idea that the way that we wish things never comes out the way that we think it does.
I think I might have a 2-track sermon. On the one hand, the parent in me, the person who was 7 years ago handed a baby and told, "Okay, you're a parent now," and I'm like, "What?" Would zero in on the witch. Not that I want to keep my. Well, you know what? I do kind of want to keep my daughter in a tower, locked away from the world. And there are times in which I do that. I don't want to. Well, it's not how I believe I should parent, but it's sometimes how I do parent, regardless of what I should do. But and this, careful what you say. Children will listen, but they don't listen in the way that you think they're listening. They're not listening to you at face value. They're much deeper than that. And I think that's an analogy to our relationship with God. We are much deeper than the face value meaning of Scripture and theology. We listen to God, and we take from our listening things that no one anticipated. The second thing I would say is I think I would go Buddhist/Stoic, as Gail did a few times. It's like it's the power of consciously choosing not to decide, consciously choosing to let the story unfold and not have to take control, not have to go out and seize what you want, but just letting it unfold and letting your place in this cosmos be your place in this cosmos.
So, Gail, you are on a sister podcast with us in the New Faith, New Media. Would you like to share a little bit about the work that you're doing through that?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So over on Faith and What Resonates, I interview people about their experiences with creativity and their faith and spirituality. So this season, I interviewed my friend Jackie Dex about sea shanties, and then I've got another friend who teaches improv and actually at one point taught at Meadville Lombard, doing both improv and ministry. And so we talk about improv and other stories like that. So what I explore is just there's a lot of like, how did your faith start and how's it going, like they're and talking about people's journeys and where they find meaning. So that's what we do over there, what I do over there, and yeah, that's on the same channel as all of this. So
great. Well, thank you so much for joining us today and being part of our conversation about Into the Woods and this musical that is so rich with meaning and symbolism. And so, and dear listener, we thank you for joining us today on A Pastor and a Priest Walk into a Movie Theater. We are a production of the New Faith, New Media company, where we share with podcasts such as Faith and What Resonates with Gail, and the new series that we're starting, Faith and the Dice, which is a panel discussion about tabletop games and other types of games and interactions and their meaning, and Breaking Fast with St. Sparkle Bear. You can catch Gail's and our shows on alternating Wednesdays, and you can catch Faith and the Dice and Breaking Fast on Fridays that alternate as well. If you like what we're doing, would you please like and share and give reviews?
Give us money.
and give us money. You can do that through Patreon and become one of our patrons, where you will have access to the Blessed Lunatic special comedy round show. And we are just so excited for all of those people who can walk with us on these moments in the woods and have these conversations with us. And so thank you for joining us, and we look forward to joining you next time when we have our discussion. It is our first A Pastor and a Priest comedy night, where we will look at the comedy of Jenny Slate's Stage Fright and have some fun with that as well. So we hope that you will join us. We hope that you're enjoying us. Please leave us feedback. Join us on Facebook on our New Faith New Media discussion page. And we are so glad that you have joined us today. I wish
More than
Yeah.
anything.